We are Conspiracy Culture. Thank you very much for coming out to participate in tonight's event. We're sure it's going to be ridiculously informative, probably pretty scary. I want to introduce Brian Law, who is responsible for bringing Dr. Colin Ross up to Toronto to do this event. He's just going to make a few announcements in regards to what's going on. You probably see some cameras and some mics, so he'll just explain that. And again, thank you for coming out. It's great to see people interested in this type of material.
Thank you, Patrick. As you said, my name is Brian Law. I'm a documentary filmmaker and currently working on a documentary about mind control, all the various aspects of it, right back to the turn of the century. And so it's my pleasure to bring up Dr. Colin Ross, who's an expert in this field. He's written such books as The CIA Doctors, documenting the human rights abuses by psychiatrists in America and worldwide, military mind control, the Osiris complex, which is all about dissociative identity disorder, commonly known as multiple personality disorder, and also a book called Satanic Ritual Abuse that was a follow-up to the Osiris complex. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Colin Ross, and I'll let him tell you everything he knows about mind control, and then it'll be followed up with a questionnaire afterwards. So thank you, and thank you.
And sorry, one more thing. Brian wanted, if everybody could just hold off in terms of raising hands or asking questions until the presentation is done, that would be greatly appreciated. So if you think you might forget, because I'm sure there'll be tons of info, maybe just make a little bit of a note, and that'll be greatly appreciated. Give it up for Dr. Colin Ross.
You want to questions after an hour or after 2 hours?
Well, we could do that, actually. Yeah, sure. We're going to take about a small break, about 1 hour in, and then maybe we can take some questions then, and we'll do the remainder of the presentation. And if anybody has any other questions at that point, we can field those questions at the end of the talk. And just to make everyone aware, as you do see, there's a few cameras here. We're filming this as part of the documentary as well. So if anybody is afraid of being on camera, just to let you know, the shot's fairly tight. We're not seeing anybody in the shot, but if you definitely do not want to be seen on camera, just approach Steve or I afterwards and let us know, and we'll put like a big Walmart smiley face over you or something just to guise your identity. So thanks very much, and Dr. Colin Ross.
Well, number one, thanks for coming. So your talk's at U of T, huh?
Oh yeah.
In Austin?
15 years. No, I teach studies in propaganda.
Was it U of T in Austin, Texas?
Really?
That's the U of T I thought you meant.
No,
Because
here.
I live in Dallas. Oh, it's U of Toronto, I see.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm a Canadian by birth, and actually born in Sarnia, so not that far away. Migrated over to Winnipeg just before I turned 7. Kind of grew up in Winnipeg. Moved with my family briefly to Sicily when I was 14. Back to Winnipeg, over to England for a few years, and then in 1970 up to the Canadian Arctic, and then in 75 down to Alberta. Did pre-med for 2 years, medical school 77 to 81 in Alberta. Back to Winnipeg to do psychiatry from 81 to 85, and then 85 to 91, medical school, academic, teaching hospital psychiatrist. And then in 91, I moved to Dallas, where I've been since. The reason for the move was basically better weather, change of pace, and much better work environment for me to do the kind of trauma, dissociative disorders work. Up till the time I left in 1991, I heard about a film called The Ugly American, but I wasn't sure who was in it. And I thought that The Ugly American was actually the Manchurian Candidate film. So I hadn't watched either. My knowledge about spies and so on was really limited to James Bond movies. And nobody ever talked about anything to do with mind control. It wasn't like there was a cover-up, because nobody knew anything about it in order to cover it up. It just didn't exist, not mentioned. And then I moved, it was November 91. Within the first kind of 3 months in Texas, so it's a private hospital with a special unit for people with multiple personality disorder, basically, now renamed dissociative identity disorder. Within the first 3 months, I started hearing, these people have tons and tons and tons and tons of physical abuse, sexual abuse, family violence, chaos, emotional neglect, all kinds of things going on in their childhoods. And so I'd heard lots of that previously, but now I started to hear a new story, which was I was taken to a hospital as a kid, or I was taken onto a military base, and a whole series of odd-seeming things were done to me, involving doctors, often with white lab coats on, scientific equipment around, EEG equipment, being physically spun around, being given different kinds of drugs, some sexual manipulation, abuse, hypnosis, drugs, a whole combination of different psychiatric things done to these people for the purpose of creating additional alter personalities that were supposed to be under the control of the doctors. So, totally from outer space. I'd never heard of this before, and it sounded relatively implausible. So I decided to look into it. And that really began kind of spring '92. And so there's only a small number of books written at that time, about 4, 5, 6. So I read those books. And then I started corresponding with the CIA, and I knew about MK Ultra, which was one of the mind control programs. And I said I wanted to look at the MK Ultra documents that were all declassified in the 70s. And so I was going to a conference in Arlington, Virginia, which is just stone's throw from the Pentagon. And I arranged that I would go and look at these documents, and then you can kind of leaf through them and then ask, I want this one and this one and this one and this one. And for 10 cents a page, they'll send them to you. And there's 15,000 pages. So it's time to hop over to the reading room. So I go downstairs. There's the front taxi in the line at the hotel. Hop in the taxi. The guy's chatting away to me. Turns out he's an ex-Afghanistan police officer who's been in the United States for a while, who takes me through the Pentagon, which seemed to be kind of out of the way. And as we're going there, it's like helicopter lands. He's talking away about being an Afghan police officer, and I'm kind of like, I think I'll just be really cool. And so then we come to the street in Arlington, and it's just a row housing kind of business area. There's no sign or anything. That's the number. This is the street. So I get off. I walk in, and I'm in a room about kind of like half this size. All kinds of military people. There's a phone on the wall that says DIA and CIA only secure phone. And I kind of walk up to the desk, still trying to act like really calm. And say, I'm here to review some documents under Freedom of Information Act request. Let's see, Freedom of Information Act request. You can just see the look on the guy's face. Because, well, we don't have anything about you. So I pull out my paperwork and a letter from the CIA saying, be here at this time and so on. Just a minute, I'll phone upstairs. Go sit in this room. So I go sit in this little waiting room, a bunch of guys in uniform. Finally, a woman comes down in the elevator, very friendly. Okay, come on up. So we get in the elevator. It's like me, about 5 guys in uniform, the CIA woman. We go up, we get off. It's not a real big building, so we go down the corridor. And there's like it's almost like a submarine hatch. There's this big Department of Justice seal, and there's a keypad. And we go in there. We go into another room where there's a woman, and she signs me in and looks at my driver's license and verifies. Then I go through another secure door that's got a big Department of Justice seal on it into the reading room. And the reading room is where they wheel in all the documents. Except the reading room, so I've gone into secure space. From there into the second secure space, into the reading room. And the reading room has an open door that is back into the hallway to go into the elevator to go downstairs. And there's a bunch of black guys doing construction work there all day. So the woman comes in, and there's like 20 perfectly sharpened pencils, those down, pad of yellow paper. In comes the cart with the 149 volumes of MK Ultra documents for me to review. So I spend all day going through these things. This one doesn't look very interesting. I'll order this one. So I ordered a bunch of them, and then later I said I might as well get all the rest anyway. So I could have saved the entire trip. But in the middle of the day, the woman who was kind of watching me to make sure I didn't steal any of these documents, thereby saving 10 cents a page, says to me, and she's like at least 80 years old, maybe 85. Totally white hair. We don't hardly say a word to each other all day. And then in the middle of the day, she goes, "What are those documents you're reviewing? Are those classified?" And I go, "No, they were all declassified in the 70s. And she goes, "Well, what do they need me here for then?" I go, "I don't know." The other thing that happened in the middle of the day was she needed to take a break to go down to the washroom, so she gets the two black guys who are the construction workers to watch me for 10 minutes while she goes down, comes back. So I suddenly realized this seems like this is the federal government running this. And I sort of lost a little respect for the incredibly detailed, controlled environment that these people had set up. So that was my introduction to CIA military mind control. And then I got all these documents and didn't read every word on every page, but pretty well scanned all of these 15,000 pages of documents. And then I went to the medical school library, many trips over. So this is kind of 92 to 98, 99. So it was just getting into the computerized medical journals era. But from 1966 back, nothing is online. You got to search all these journals by hand. So you literally drive to the library, park, walk through the parking lot, go upstairs, and you go to whatever, Journal of Nervous and Mental Disease, 1950. So I didn't go back before the Second World War. Pull out 1950, and the 12 issues for the months there, you look at the table of contents, scan through, oh, here's an article on LSD. Or, oh, here's an article by this doctor whose name I already know. Take it over to the photocopy machine, and charge up my card, photocopy a pile of papers, take them back home. So I go 1950, 51, all the way up to 75. So I've got some target journals, and I'm looking for some specific articles. And then in all these journals, I'm looking for either interesting paper title or interesting doctor's name. And then I take all these papers home, and I read them. Then I look in the references at the back of the paper, and I go, oh, this reference, I need this one, I need that one, I need that one. I go back to the library, photocopy those papers, and then I look at the references to those papers and end up with an overfull filing cabinet of basically early 50s to early 70s papers, all published in the public domain, regular medical journals sitting there in the medical school library. So that's kind of my information base. Nobody's ever dropped off a brown envelope with some interesting stuff in it. Nothing that I'm going to talk about is based on somebody told me a story that, or somebody believes that. This is all what's in the documents. Now I'll do a few little, side meanders through some conspiracy theory type stuff. But basically I'm talking about the documented facts which are stranger than fiction. And I thought I'd just start with a kind of related and unrelated story in a sense. Actually, two stories. Just to illustrate, my take on how I think the world works. Did they tell you when you're coming in that we have to take a DNA sample and just pop a chip in your arm? Okay. Thought you'd be comfortable with that. So here's just a random story of a strange coincidence that happened one day. The day was Cinco de Mayo, 5th of May, 1979. Some of you may know this story already. So Jimmy Carter is, they're running up to his competition with Ronald Reagan. So he's got this thing that he's talked about in public, which I don't know the exact details of it, but the basic idea is he's got this new scheme he's going to announce, which is a big shakeup in the way the economy's managed and how the money flows and who's the favorite and everything. And he's going to present this to a Latino audience, because obviously the Latino audience is going to like what he's saying. And now this is, you can Google this still today. This is all reported in the mainstream media. All of a sudden there's a commotion in the crowd at this talk he's giving, and these two guys are wrestled to the ground, and they have starter pistols. So nobody's injured at all. And these guys say, one of them's a white guy and one of them's a Hispanic guy from Mexico. And they say that they didn't know each other prior to a couple days ago. And several Mexican guys approached them, and they practiced shooting off the starter pistols on the hotel roof the night before, which were given to them by these guys. And they were told to create a diversion, and one of the other guys would be the sniper who would shoot Carter during the commotion. So the Secret Service looked into this, thought these guys are just, full of it basically. And they said, well, the guy who recruited us for this operation, who was going to be the sniper, was in such and such a hotel and such a room number. So the Secret Service go to the room number, and there's a shotgun case and some shells. So then they go, I wonder if there's something to this. So then these guys are booked, and that's the end of the story. Like, were they convicted or not convicted? Did they ever go to prison? What did they do after that? Did anybody follow them up? Not a word. And then the mainstream media, so what you're probably thinking, where's the coincidence in this story? The mainstream media reported there's a strange coincidence. These guys' names were Raymond Lee Harvey and Osvaldo Ortiz. Raymond Shaw being the shooter in the Manchurian Candidate movie. So reportedly, again, mainstream media, Jimmy Carter went back to Andrews Air Force Base, canceled the whole financial plan, never heard anything about that again, went back to Andrews Air Force Base and said to somebody who was there, I've lost control of the government. And so this is not like covered up, this is in the mainstream media. But the way it's covered up is, what a funny coincidence. What are the odds that Raymond Lee Harvey and Osvaldo Ortiz are going to meet each other and be involved in this plot? It's so patently ridiculous that obviously that's not what is actually going on. But the effort to cover it up is just kind of saying, it's a funny coincidence, reporting it in the mainstream media. Everybody kind of goes, well, that's good, what's on TV tonight? And it just kind of passes by. And that's kind of the way the cover-up of all this mind control experimentation worked. It's not that it didn't happen, it was published in all these mainstream journals. And at the bottom of the papers, it often says, funded by Department of the Army, funded by U.S. Office of Naval Research, funded by Air Force Office of Scientific Research. It never says funded by the Central Intelligence Agency. But we know that just from reading the journals that it's military funded at a minimum. And what is done to people is described right in these papers that are on the shelf at the medical school. And the way to cover it up is just kind of go, whatever. I'm too busy to think about it. I'm just talking about the declassified stuff that I actually have in the documents. Of course, there's layers and layers and layers and layers and layers that are totally like classified, totally covered up, that nobody knows anything about. So the second story is how the financial system is managed, which again, some of you may know the story, some of you may know the details, some not. So, by the way, it's very clear that Jimmy Carter got the message even if the general public didn't get the message. So September, October 2008, the economy is just about to go crash, and one of the largest financial institutions in the United States, Washington Mutual, is in danger of collapsing. And this is actually standard government practice, apparently. On Friday, now, you might think I made a mistake, and this actually took place in Uruguay, some kind of banana republic. No insult to Uruguay, I've never been there. This is the United States of America. The government on Friday comes and seizes the bank. There's no lawsuit or big long set of legal briefs or debate in court. They just walk in, seize it, now we own it. So I know that happens in South America. The government comes and seizes the banana company or the orange juice factory. Apparently it also happens in the United States. So this is good because we can't afford to let this bank collapse because the effect on the economy will just be catastrophic. So we, the people, through our agents, who are not telling us what they're doing, seize the bank. And this is in the same time frame as we're just gearing up for an $800 billion bailout. And we already have, at the start of the Obama administration, the deficit was 12 trillion, now it's 16 trillion. So we're kind of running in the red there. And we're going to have to bail people out 800 billion worth. But this is good because now we own this bank. This is our property, we the people, because we've seized it. Which doesn't make us highway robbers, just makes us citizens. And now we have to, of course, do something with it. So Washington Mutual had worth of $306 billion, which included $188 billion of deposits in the bank. And the government's afraid there's going to be a run on the bank, everybody will take the money out, and there's not enough money in there, and the whole thing will crash. A lot of this had to do with all these upside-down mortgages and, you know, crazy mortgage rules and everything. So the FDIC, which is the federal body that insures mortgages, was on the hook for $31 billion worth of debt held by Washington Mutual. But the FDIC only had $42 billion in assets. So if Washington Mutual collapsed, then they would owe $31 billion worth of insurance payments on all this collapsed mortgages, which would almost wipe out all their assets. Well, that's kind of a little problem for the government. So what happened on the weekend was the FDIC's liability for this $31 billion was erased. So they no longer were on the hook for $31 billion. The people who bought Washington Mutual from the taxpayers took over this $31 billion in liabilities, which was only a liability. It hadn't, nothing had actually happened. They didn't actually have to pay it. And here we are with this $800 billion bailout coming up. We've got $306 billion asset in our pocket with $31 million liability, but we've erased that, so no need to worry about that. So now we could sell it, which would be kind of handy because that would cover maybe 3/8 of our bailout costs. So being the good business people we are, on Sunday, Washington Mutual was sold to JP Morgan for $1.9 billion. And in this very stressed financial quarter, surprisingly, JP Morgan operated in the black. So this is obviously a backroom deal. This is not the government of the people, for the people, and by the people. So I'm giving you a little feel for how I see the system operating in general, just so we know we're all in the same club here. But I really wasn't tuned into all that stuff before moving to Texas and before starting to hear these stories. And so the more I looked into these stories, the more evidence piled up and piled up and piled up and piled up. And I'd had kind of, as a psychiatrist, 2 rounds before this of hearing ridiculous, incredible stories. Stories like I was sexually abused by my dad when I was a girl. The reason I knew these were ridiculous stories is because my professors told me. Because in the comprehensive textbook of psychiatry, which was my main textbook, 81 to 85 when I was in my psychiatry training, it's almost 3,500 pages long. Way at the back, there's a little small section about incest, with one paragraph talking about how common incest is, with one reference to a 1955 study saying it's 1 family out of 1 million in North America. It's actually more than 1 out of 100. These were the official medical facts. And the official position of the profession of psychiatry throughout the 20th century was Freudian Oedipal fantasies never happened. So there you have a cover-up, which isn't really a sort of a government conspiracy cover-up. And I don't think psychiatrists are getting together and hatching a plan for how they were going to cover it up. They're just kind of stumbling and bumbling through life somehow. This guild, whose one of their guild functions was to say all this child sexual abuse wasn't going on. But I would say technically it probably wasn't a conscious conspiracy. And then in the late 80s, people started publishing papers where here's a group of people with this diagnosis, or here's a group of people with this diagnosis. And incredibly, 50 or 60% of them claim they're sexually abused as children. So my personal experience and the collective experience of psychiatry was, we had all these false memories of childhood sexual abuse, and we knew it was all hysteria. And then we found out there's actually a rampant epidemic of childhood sexual abuse, and probably 99% of these stories are true. So that was, we officially said it didn't happen when actually it did. And then in the late 80s and into the early 90s, one of my books is called Satanic Ritual Abuse, Principles of Treatment. published by a very fringe publisher called the University of Toronto Press. And the whole purpose of the book is, okay, there's these people describing growing up in these satanic cults with all this child sacrifice and stuff. No evidence that it's real, but you don't know for a fact it's not real. And everybody's having a big debate about is it real, not real. But what are you going to do right now with this person sitting in front of you in therapy? So it's about the strategies and the techniques, where it's the same strategies, same techniques, same interventions, same treatment goals, whether you assume that the memories are mostly real or whether you assume they're mostly not real. So it's a way to get around the whole real, not real controversy. And it's really about clinical work and therapy, not about broad social issues. But the basic sequence of events is we have all this fantasies of sexual abuse that we know are just fantasies. Turns out they're real. Now we have these allegations of all the satanic ritual abuse. It could be the same pattern again. Everybody, all the official people are saying it's not real, that's ridiculous, there's no cults like that, it's impossible, where are the bodies? It might turn out it is real. Or it might turn out this time it's not. And basically that issue never gets resolved. And then we come to wave number 3, which is I start hearing all this stuff about this military mind control experimentation. Okay, which way is this one going to go, real or not real? And it turns out, the more I get into it, in the satanic ritual abuse, you never can actually get to documents and facts. It's just kind of like you're in the fog trying to find some documentation, because it's always something that happened 30 years ago. You can't go ask the dad, because he's either dead or isn't going to tell you. You don't have any investigative resources. You're a clinician. You got to try to figure out how to help this person be less suicidal. Then we get into the military mind control arena, and it's kind of open question. How much of this is going to actually get documented and proven? And it just turns out that the pile of documents gets bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger. So that's my personal kind of story of my walk through this. And, oh, by the way, this is, if you're at the top of the hill at our family cabin in Manitoba, and you turn around and look about this way, you'll kind of see this view. So this is in lake country in eastern Manitoba. That's all my contact information. These are the 2 books that deal mostly with this. So since I've mentioned false memory questions here, and I personally was attacked in a lot of public venues for being a person who generated tons of false memories in patients. So I was in this false memory wars in the 1990s. And now I'm going to do another little story just to show you that, in fact, there are false memories here. That people do make allegations of CIA military mind control, which are obviously impossible. And this is an example of that. So a woman comes to the emergency department claiming that her boss at her university made her sit in a room entirely lined with leaves and gave her a bunch of LSD, and she's had a bad trip and now she's in the emergency department. So you could talk to 10,000 psychiatrists in the United States, and you'd be lucky to find 2 who didn't know for a fact this is obviously impossible, delusional, false memory. There's no way. Come on, a room that's all lined with leaves. There we are. Okay, so this is the Ames Leaf Room. Called the Ames Leaf Room because it was designed by Dr. Ames on contract to the Office of Naval Research. And it's basically a box that's got leaves glued to all the walls, and it's open at this end. You can look into it. So the Ames Leaf Room, in fact, exists. And this is Amadeo Marazzi, who was a big wig in chemical warfare for the Army and was also a mind control contractor. This is a paper in the journal Schizophrenia. It says at the bottom of the first page of the article that supported by the Air Force. That's Air Force Office of Scientific Research, is what that stands for. And this is a picture of his experiment at the University of Minnesota, where the subject is sitting in the Ames Leaf Room. And he's got 2 knobs that he can move to adjust that white bar that's at the far end of the room. And he's got it adjusted so it appears to be perfectly horizontal to him. While he's in the Ames Leaf room, he's wearing these goggles that have special lenses called anisoconic lenses that distort all the angles so that nothing seems to meet up properly. It's all out of perspective, doesn't make any sense. And he's high on LSD, funded by the Air Force. So as a result of this experimentation, Dr. Marazzi was able to determine that if you sit in a leaf room wearing lenses and you're high on LSD, you can't see straight. That's a pretty high-level science. Mary Ray, his research assistant at the University of Minnesota, whose medical record of her visit to the emergency department I have in my possession, testified at U.S. Senate committee hearings in the 70s telling this whole story, which is absolutely objective, absolutely real, absolutely happened. Point being, it's just like when you go on the internet and look at conspiracy stuff. There's some solid stuff, and then there's not so solid, and then you can't rely on the reliability of some of the information. When something appears to be completely ridiculous, stupid, impossible, crazy, too far over the top, it could actually be real. So my attitude is not to dismiss anything out of hand or know for a fact that it isn't real, which I learned from looking into things here. So this is a quote from this Amadeo Marazzi guy's paper. Army Chemical Corps, where he worked, which is a site of tons of LSD experimentation, many different drugs tested on prisoners. The Army Chemical Corps next provided the opportunity for exploration of the nervous system with more powerful substances, both in the laboratories and in the field, and for the realization of a strong desire to reversibly reproduce and control derangements at the highest integrative levels, including the mind. So when we talk about mind control, there's control and there's mind. I mean, that's what these guys are working on. It's not something we're alleging. They clearly are trying to control the mind at the highest levels. This is something that's on the internet that you can find. That's the address. And it's unverified. I don't know if this is like a set up scene that was just made up, or this is an actual experiment. But this is the type of experiments that were done under MKUltra. All kinds of wild, crazy things. So this is, I don't know for a fact this is a real experiment, but it very well could be. So the World War II ended in 1945. During the Second World War, in the United States, there was no central coordinating intelligence agency. There's all this fragmented, different branches of the military, and the decision was made to create a central intelligence agency called the Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, which operated till the end of the war. And then there was kind of a 2-year lull period, and then in 1947 the CIA was formed, mostly from prior OSS guys. So the CIA was formed in 1947, so obviously there can't be a CIA mind control experimentation before that. And there may have been experimentation by the CIA in the late 40s, but there's no documents on that. In terms of the documents, it starts in 1950. And that's an important little subnote there. There's always disinformation denial about everything. So one of the disinformation denial stories that we hear all the time is, we only got into this, and this story's been told for like half a century now, we only got into this defensively in reaction to what the communist Chinese were doing during the Korean War. And we had our pilots who were captured. They were subjected to some sort of interrogation, brainwashing techniques. They came back home and they made false confessions of germ warfare. And then we tried to figure out, how did the communist Chinese get them to make those false confessions? So we're the good guys, and we're only doing that defensively. The Korean War started in June 1970. Bluebird was signed into operation by the director of the CIA in April 1950. So it can't be reactive to what was going on. So that's clearly disinformation. So there's this series of programs. They're all declassified. And you can order the documents now on CD-ROM for $35 instead of 10 cents a page times 15,000. So Bluebird actually started probably in 50, but ran to about 53. Some of these years are a little bit fuzzy. It could be 54. It was rolled over into Artichoke, which then in turn was rolled over into Project MK Ultra, which ran until 63, which was in turn rolled over into MK Search, which ran until 72, 73. And in parallel with that, there was a bunch of other programs, some of which you can't get any documents on at all, some of which you can get like 30 pages. So there's Project Often, Project Darby Hat, Project Third Chance, MK Naomi, and Project Stargate. MK Naomi apparently was named after the secretary of one of the senior CIA guys involved in the program. MK designates a certain division of the CIA that was running the program. That's what MKL stands for. Why Ultra? Don't know. There was a deciphering, decoding Ultra program in the Pacific in the Second World War. But it just seems to be kind of like random cover names. But anyway, these are the documented programs. And then there's Stargate, which I forget the exact year, but in the 90s, I remember watching Ted Koppel interviewing Robert Gates, who at that time was the head of the CIA, and the chief officer who was the liaison between the CIA and the military on Project Stargate. And they themselves said, yes, Project Stargate existed. We spent at least $20 million on it and ran up until at least 1984. And that's the psychic spying remote viewing program. So this is not a rumor, this is admitted to it. And the Robert Gates was Mr. Skeptic. I don't think this really worked. We kind of wasted some money. But the liaison guy between the CIA and the military said, no, we actually got operationally useful hits that were confirmed by other intelligence investigations on things like, so these guys go sit down in a room and they basically astrally project themselves either to a set of coordinates that are given, longitude, latitude, or are missing pilots in Central America who went down in the jungle somewhere. And they end up kind of over the site, and then they produce a sketch of the site, or they produce the coordinates of the crash site, and then people go to the crash site and there it is. So these are the programs that actually existed. There's another program that, when you get into this, you hear about these other programs, the most famous one being Monarch. So I've heard many people say they were in Monarch, and I filed Freedom of Information Act requests with all the branches of the military, Defense Intelligence Agency, CIA, and all of them said they had nothing on Project Monarch. So I would say it's kind of a flip of the coin. There actually never was a Project Monarch. It's just an urban legend or disinformation. Or there actually was a project actually called Monarch, or there was a project that was exactly like Project Monarch, it just wasn't called Project Monarch. So I don't know which is actually the fact, but I'm sure that these programs, I can't prove this, but I personally am sure these kind of programs are operational up to the present, and includes something like Project Monarch. But basically, lights turn off in 1973. Everything after that is classified. So these are some of the other ones, Project Chat. So it's just a whole list of them. So you can see there was a lot of programs. And MK Ultra is kind of the most talked about, most heard of, most well known of them. It consisted of 149 sub-projects, almost all in the United States. When you look at some of the other documents, like Project Often is actually a lot more sinister, a lot more unethical, and a lot more harmful to the participants than MK Ultra. In the scheme of things, MK Ultra, funnily, is one of the sort of blander projects. It's not bland, but compared to what went on in Project Often, it's really not the most sinister one. And MK Ultra is a specific program that ran for a specific period of time. But it's also used as kind of an informal umbrella term for all the mind control programs. So you have to kind of watch out. Somebody will tell me, I was involved in MK Ultra as a victim, experimental subject, in 1984. So I don't go, well, that's impossible because MKUltra stopped then. I'll explain that MKUltra is used loosely as an umbrella term, but technically speaking, it couldn't have been an MKUltra because it stopped, in the early 60s. So it's important to be aware of that. And so another question about this is, who are these mad scientists in a basement somewhere doing this outside normal regulatory oversight kind of channels? Well, they were people at obscure institutions like Cornell, McGill, MIT, Johns Hopkins, Columbia, Princeton, Stanford. So these experiments at top secret clearance level were done at basically all the major teaching institutions in the United States. And the contractors cleared at top secret included leading figures in psychiatry and psychology, past presidents of major professional organizations, editors of leading psychiatry journals. It's kind of a who's who of psychiatry. It's not some, rogue psychiatrist in a basement somewhere that nobody knew about. It's systemic, it's pervasive, and it's the basically intellectual and political elite of psychiatry in the know and running this throughout at least 1950 to 75 time frame. And one of my sons went to Cornell, and my parents went to McGill. So it's not hard to have personal connections to these kind of things. When I was in Winnipeg, I was actually there from 81 to 91, so psychiatry training and then as a psychiatrist. One of the most famous things in MKUltra is Ewan Cameron at the Allen Memorial Institute in Montreal. And one of the people, so 9 people sued the CIA for the experimentation done on them in McGill by Ewan Cameron under funding from the CIA, and the CIA settled out of court. So this is, again, for a fact, stuff that went on, because the CIA didn't debate that it happened, and they also provided a very puny amount of compensation for an out-of-court settlement. And in my CIA doctor's book, in the 90s, I went to Vancouver and interviewed Linda MacDonald, who's been on a variety of different documentaries, who's a very charming, talented, very sane, normal-seeming person, very engaging. In 1963, I think it was early 60s, she had a whole bunch of young kids. She was overwhelmed and somewhat depressed. Her family doctor referred her to Ewan Cameron in Montreal. She went in for treatment of kind of mildish to moderate depression. Ended up, and I have all of her medical records, including papers with Ewan Cameron's signature on it. Ended up with 103 ECT treatments, electroshock treatments, from spring to September, which is a lot, except he used what's called the Page-Russell technique. I don't know who Page and Russell were, but normally when you do ECT, you push the button and there's zzz, electricity goes through your brain, and that's it. That's one dose of ECT. In the Page-Russell technique, the button is pushed 6 times. There's 6 times the energy. So this is the equivalent of over 600 electric shock treatments delivered between May and September. And Ewan Cameron published this in mainstream leading journals, and he called it de-patterning. And he did it on purpose. The goal was to de-pattern the person. And it's a couple of years ago we went to Buchenwald, which is one of the Auschwitz-type death camps in Germany, and you can go in there and see all the rooms and everything. And so it's pretty overwhelming. But it's not, I don't know what to call it. It's not exactly eerie. It's not exactly scary. It's just very disturbing. So there's piles of shoes and piles of glasses, and obviously a lot of people died there. But the strangest part of it to me was there's a little notebook there, and it's like German engineering. It's all very neat. It's all very tiny. There's columns. It's handwritten. And it's, this person arrived on this day with these personal articles which were confiscated, and this is the person's number. The next person, the next person. It's all just business as usual. It's just like the shipping and receiving department. It's not a hint of anything out of the ordinary. It's the same thing when you look at the nursing notes in Linda McDonald's records. It's like blood pressure, pulse, patient did or didn't eat. It's like routine medical records. No, there's no, oh my God, because we didn't have texting back then. It's totally business as usual, nothing out of the ordinary going on. And it'll say, blood pressure such and such, patient incompetent of stool and feces. Patient disoriented ×3, which means she doesn't know who she is, she doesn't know where she is, and she doesn't know what the year is, because she's been depatterned. She literally couldn't control her bowels or bladder, didn't know her own name, didn't recognize her husband or her children, wiped out. Which is a good psychiatric treatment, because the idea is you're trying to wipe out that old mental illness, and then after you've done the depatterning, you want to create a new personality, which it's in the book. I think it was the Montreal Star. It was one of the newspapers. There's a glowing headline, "New Personalities Made to Order." It's, oh, wow, psychiatry is really making some advances here. Now we can wipe out the previous personality and all the mental illness, and then we can build a healthy new personality. And the way we did that was psychic driving. So psychic driving involved, and this is all, again, published in mainstream journals. Psychic driving involved playing two tape loops for hours and hours and hours and hours and hours, either in the doctor's voice or the patient's voice, saying, you love your mother, or you're a good citizen, or whatever it might be. And there would be weeks of barbiturate and other medication-induced sleep. And sometimes he would throw in some hallucinogens. This was just a guy trying to learn how to help patients. Except it was funded by the CIA, who obviously are not medical research people. Why is the CIA interested in depatterning? Well, when you read the Artichoke and Bluebird documents, they discuss this, they discuss that. One of the topics of discussion is the problem of disposal of subjects. That's the heading. And then they discuss in there, what are we going to do with these people? How are we going to get rid of them? And we can't just kill them all. Obviously, they did kill a bunch of people. But one thing we can do is wipe out their memories. So this was obviously contracted to figure out how to wipe out people's memories. And why an intelligence agency would be interested in that is extremely obvious. But he's doing it as if it's medical research. But he's not telling the patients what it is he's actually doing or who's funding it. So that by itself is a completely wild violation of medical ethics. When she's ready for discharge, he instructed the family not to remind her about her past, because that might be upsetting for her. And she described having to learn skills such as boiling an egg, going to the bathroom by herself, and when her kids would go to play, she had to, first of all, she had a nanny all the time because she couldn't function. She had a board with a map of the neighborhood, and she would put pins for where each kid was, because her short-term memory was like only a couple of minutes. She gradually got it all back. Talks normally, functions normally, engaging human being, with total amnesia from age 25 or so, when she entered the Allen Memorial Institute back to birth. It's all wiped out. And these are experiments that happened at McGill. So this is and now what we're talking about is not the bad stuff, the mild stuff that they declassified. This is the tip of the iceberg. So what else went on in the tip of the iceberg? Before I get into more examples, so there's all these universities. Other MK Ultra institutions include, that looks like a typo. I thought that said the Cali Cartel. It's actually Eli Lilly. Sorry, I made a mistake there. So who do you think were the first major manufacturers and distributors of LSD in North America? Hippies, beatniks. No, it wasn't any hippies yet. Beatniks. But the CIA doesn't itself personally manufacture LSD. They would have to contract with somebody.
Sandoz.
They gave it to their own guys.
Sandoz Pharmaceuticals. The story of LSD, real quick. You're correct, not 100% correct. Let me tell you the story. So, and this is all in documents that I've read. The CIA guys always refer to the Russians as the Soviet. So that was the phraseology, the Soviet this and the Soviet that. So they're concerned that the Soviet might buy up the entire world supply of LSD, which is manufactured by Sandoz Pharmaceuticals, based in Switzerland, because Albert Hofmann accidentally discovered LSD and went on the first LSD trip in the early 40s, because he was researching the sort of fungus it's kind of like you take the opium poppy and you turn it into heroin. You take this fungus and you turn it into LSD. It's kind of a series of steps. So Sandoz was the supplier of LSD. Hence the song by Eric Burdon in the 60s, A Girl Named Sandoz. That was a pop song. So the CIA was concerned that the Soviet was going to buy up the entire world supply of LSD from Sandoz Pharmaceuticals, which they wanted for their own mind control experimentation interrogation. So they contracted with Eli Lilly Company in 1953 and 1954 for $400,000, which was a lot of money back then, to manufacture and supply a secure quantity of LSD to them. So the first manufacturers and distributors of LSD in North America was Eli Lilly Company. Funnily enough, LSD works on the serotonin system in the brain. The first selective serotonin reuptake inhibitor antidepressant, which works on the serotonin system, was Prozac, manufactured by Eli Lilly Company. So how they developed their expertise in brain serotonin physiology was by being the first manufacturers of LSD. Totally outrageous fact. National Institute of Health and National Institute of Mental Health. Both top secret cleared contractors. The Office of Naval Research. So a lot of this money is kind of shunted around. So the CIA will give money to the Navy, and then the Navy will do something, and then the Navy will do something else, and it comes back to the CIA. It flows around the system. Public Health Service, Bureau of Narcotics, which is the precursor of the DEA. Holy mackerel, what a coincidence. It's by random chance I told you a story about J.P. Morgan buying Washington Mutual for $1.9 billion. It turns out J.P. Morgan was a top secret cleared MK Ultra contractor itself. All this stuff is somehow interconnected, even if you can't connect all the dots. So a lot of these LSD and other experiments were funded jointly by the CIA, by the Public Health Service, and by the Masons, basically, through the Scottish Rite Foundation. At the National Institute of Health, there's a researcher called Maitland Baldwin, whose papers I have, who is basically putting, he's doing a couple different things, electrode implant type stuff in monkeys, and beaming, he was mostly sound energy. So there's two sort of types of energy that are used to beam at animals and humans' brains. There's sound and there's electromagnetic. So he was knocking monkeys out with sound, and there was discussion in the documents about how you could hide this signal inside urban noise, knock a human being out with an otherwise inaudible sound signal. He's a co-author of Wilder Penfield, who's the most respected Canadian neurosurgeon of all time, who worked at McGill in the same time frame that Ewan Cameron was an MK Ultra contractor at McGill. Ewan Cameron was at various times head of the Quebec Psychiatric Association, the Canadian Psychiatric Association, the World Psychiatric Association, of which he was one of the co-founders, and the Society for Biological Psychiatry. The Society for Biological Psychiatry held numerous meetings and conferences and published the proceedings with and without direct funding by the CIA. Ewan Cameron was part of the team headed by an American psychiatrist called Leo Alexander, who went over and interviewed the Nazi doctors for the Nuremberg trials. In the death camps, the Nazi doctors, the Nazi psychiatrists, were working on all kinds of crazy, Mengele type experiments, but this included hallucinogen experiments with mescaline and other drugs. So Ewan Cameron had never done hallucinogen research himself, obviously had top secret clearance if he's part of the US team going over to interview the Nazi doctors, goes over and interviews the Nazi doctors who presumably tell him about conducting hallucinogen experiments in the death camps, comes back to Montreal and conducts hallucinogen experiments in Montreal with funding by CIA and other sources, including the Health Protectorate branch of the Canadian government. So Linda MacDonald, she didn't settle with the CIA because the CIA funding stopped, and which was, I forget the exact year, like 58-ish or so, and then it was picked up by the Canadian government. And so she sued the Canadian government, and as a result of her lawsuit, there's a 1-800 number set up, and you automatically get $100,000 tax-free if you can document that you were a depatterning subject of Ewan Cameron's at McGill. So the Canadian government has directly admitted liability and culpability. And this is all kind of somewhat discombobulating because when I was a kid in Winnipeg growing up and planning on becoming a psychiatrist, I read about William Osler, who's a very famous Canadian doctor in the 19th century. I read about Wilder Penfield, the greatest neurosurgeon Canada's ever produced. And then I find out these guys are, not Osler, but Penfield is all tangled up with Maitland Baldwin, who's a top secret cleared MK Ultra contractor himself. And Maitland, at McGill, at the same time as Maitland Baldwin is partnered up with Penfield, there's William Tyhurst, who's doing LSD experiments funded by Canada's Defence Research Board. And there's Donald Hebb, who's probably the most famous Canadian psychologist ever, also funded by the Canadian military. So there's a lot of people being funded, not just Ewan Cameron. He wasn't just an isolated guy. But the story is always, oh, the one isolated guy who kind of went off the deep end a little bit. Ionia State Hospital. So I have a hospital-based trauma program in Dallas that I consult to, and one in LA and one in Grand Rapids, Michigan. And Ionia is not far from Grand Rapids. And this is an interesting story. So this is an MK Ultra project at Ionia State Hospital, and this is, again, a published paper, plus I have the MK Ultra files. This is incarcerated sex offenders are the experimental subjects here. The psychiatrists involved all are former military psychiatrists, documented fact, and they're cleared at top secret under the MK Ultra contract. And what they do is they give these guys LSD, marijuana, barbiturates, and they interview them, aka interrogate them. And the purpose of the project is to try and get them to confess to sex crimes that they've never been charged with. And the purpose of that is because you want to see if you can give this concoction of different techniques to an enemy agent or some person of interest, will they confess to something that they wouldn't otherwise have confessed to? So, these are doctors in a civilian hospital with sex offenders who've been legally committed to the hospital, who are there to help them, who are giving them addictive drugs and trying to get them to confess to crimes that they've never talked about before, which is obviously not in their legal best interest. It's just insane, ridiculous, so far out of the realm of reasonable medical ethics and reasonable human conduct. And that, again, is just what we know about. Atlanta Federal Penitentiary was another guy who was actually in Saskatchewan. There's a famous Canadian psychiatrist, Hoffer, who was a multivitamin treatment of schizophrenia guy that I was taught was just a laughable idiot because you can't treat schizophrenia with vitamins. And that was all I ever heard about him. But he was a partner of Humphrey Osmond, who then moved to the United States and partnered with a guy, Carl Pfeiffer, who did experiments at the New Jersey Reformatory in Bordentown and in Atlanta Federal Penitentiaries. And this is giving LSD. There's a Lexington Narcotics Farm was another prison where incarcerated criminals who are drug addicts are given drugs experimentally. So this is helping them with sobriety and recovery? I mean, it's just absurd. And why would we be wanting to give drug addicts LSD to help them with their recovery? There's actually, amazingly enough, a whole literature, and this is papers and books, often funded directly by the CIA, where the psychiatrists are talking about using LSD as a therapy. There was a large literature on this. They thought they could cure alcoholism, cure all kinds of neurotic conflicts, depression, whatever it might be. And when the FDA made LSD illegal in the 60s, these guys, in writing, in public, protested because this was just a big blow against psychiatry and setting us backwards and robbing us of this wonderful therapy technique. So they simultaneously talked as if they thought it was a wonderful therapy technique and were using it as an interrogation method for the CIA, and were using it on guys who were already in jail because of drug addiction problems. So there's all these kind of layers and elements of it all mixed up. The Bureau of Narcotics. There's a guy named George White. He's either three or four MK Ultra projects, I forget exactly how many. And he worked for the Bureau of Narcotics. And his program was called Operation Midnight Climax. I think you'll be able to figure out why it's called Operation Midnight Climax when I tell you about it. So when you look at the actual files for these sub-projects, they're actually really boring, except for a few pages. Because what it is check after check after check, requisition after requisition after requisition, sort of boring bureaucratic paperwork. But what the checks and the requisitions are for are a little bit in New York, but mostly in San Francisco, setting up a safe house decorated like a brothel. And I mean, it's really like a brothel. So you see they're ordering like purple vel satin stuff and sheets and paintings, etc. And of course they need a one-way mirror. So what the operation was is George White hired prostitutes to go to bars and pick guys up, bring them back to the safe house, have sex with them and slip them LSD without their knowing it, and the CIA guys would make scientific observations of this through the one-way mirror, which is for purely professional reasons, you understand. So this is Operation Midnight Climax, and it says in the documents the purpose of this is to study the effects of an unwitting dose of LSD under conditions that mimic a field interrogation. So, and then the other documents describe they've got some like enemy character and they're interrogating him and they slip him LSD without his knowing it. Does it or does it not help with the interrogation? So, these are unwitting civilians, haven't given informed consent, don't know they're getting LSD, and there's no follow-up. How did they go off the rails? Did they have fun? Did they go home? What happened? No idea whatsoever. Absolute and total violation of medical ethics. And there's doctors under MK Ultra and MK Search directly involved in this experimentation. So I read those documents and I thought, oh, well, that's an interesting story. And one of the documentaries that I've been involved in, just as like one of the guys who gets interviewed, they actually go to the place where the safe house was and talk to the landlord, and he says, oh yeah, that was going on back in the 60s, we know all about that. And then I was looking through the documents again one day, and there's a letter from one of the guys running Operation Midnight Climax to one of the guys back at CIA headquarters, just kind of chatting about how it was going, difficulties of, getting the landlord to agree to the whole thing and recruiting the prostitutes, etc. And then we're just down at the bottom, it says, it's a lot more difficult than you would think to create these Jekyll-Hyde personalities. So Jekyll-Hyde personalities equals multiple personality equals the Manchurian candidate. So why is there a comment about the difficulty of creating Jekyll-Hyde personalities when there's only one contact with each of the Johns? He has sex and he gives LSD. You can't possibly be creating a new identity in that guy. So the only possible person you could be creating a new identity in is the prostitute. So my theory, which I can't prove, is that there's two layers. There's always layers and levels and layers and levels and layers and levels. So one layer is, this never happened, we never did it, are you crazy? The next layer is, we were just testing LSD here, which is probably part of the purpose of it, but I think that the underlying purpose was, these are Manchurian candidate prostitutes who were being run through simulations to see whether they could turn a trick and attempt to extract information from the guy, and maybe LSD would help with that. So that's not conclusive proof, but it's pretty suspicious circumstantial evidence that Manchurian candidate programs were run actually through MKUltra itself, not other programs. But this term Jekyll-Hyde personality, which we all know as Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, is used repeatedly by G.H. Estabrooks, who is not himself actually an MKUltra contractor. I have his document, all kinds of documents that I got from his archives at Colgate University in upstate New York. He was actually Canadian by birth, but spent his career in the United States. And he, at various times, did seminars on military uses of hypnosis and creating the super spy on a variety of different military bases. He had lead, like second, third in command at the FBI guys come to Colgate, and military psychiatrists come to Colgate to attend conferences on military uses of hypnosis, creating the super spy. And by the super spy, he meant the Manchurian candidate. And I have the actual photocopies of the correspondence back and forth between him and J. Edgar Hoover, spanning the 30s into the 60s. And in the artichoke documents, his name is whited out, but he describes in great detail, he's basically pitching creating Manchurian candidates to the CIA. And you can tell from the details of the vocabulary and the examples. And when you look at where his name is whited out, you can count down from the line above and see how many letters there are. It's exactly the right number of letters to be his name. And in 1943, in his textbook Hypnotism, and as late as 1971 in an article in a magazine called Science Digest, he describes creating Manchurian candidates, which is artificial multiple personality, just like the Bourne identity, during the Second World War for operational use on contract to the Army. And I have a copy of his contract with the Department of the Army from the Second World War. I have him corresponding with, publishing with, and inviting to his conferences documented top secret cleared MKUltra contractors who are hypnosis experts and directly involved in Manchurian candidate type experiments. And he describes this in minute detail. So he would have a military guy, he would condition him. He doesn't really describe exactly how he did it in detail, but all the techniques are basically in the MKUltra and Bluebird and Artichoke documents. He would create, there's Jones A as the original guy, then he would create Jones B, which he called a Jekyll-Hyde personality. So he used this phrase Jekyll-Hyde personality quite a lot. And an example of an operation would be Jones is called in to see this colonel, and the colonel has been told what the hypnotically implanted code word is. It's the moon is clear. So this guy comes in, he thinks that he's being sent to Tokyo on a routine unclassified courier assignment. He's given the assignment, and then the military guy in Washington goes, the moon is clear. Jones B comes out, the military guy in Washington gives him the classified information, flips him back to his regular self. He flies over to Tokyo. The colonel at the far end says, oh, hi, nice to meet you, thank you. That's the above board assignment. The guy at the far end says the moon is clear. Out comes Jones B, gives him the information, the response is inserted, back he goes. And he describes these guys having complete amnesia for the operation and being used operationally in a variety of settings during the Second World War. So this is highly, highly, highly plausible because of all the documented connections this guy has with all these other contractors, including J. Edgar Hoover himself. Just a kind of random aside here. I also have from a JFK researcher that I met some years back, he sent me a copy of a 1960 memo from J. Edgar Hoover to the head of naval intelligence. J. Edgar Hoover was 1960. 1960 is 3 years before 1963, just in case you don't have the arithmetic right. In 1960, J. Edgar Hoover himself personally is asking the head of naval intelligence to investigate Marguerite Oswald concern that somebody is doubling as their son in Europe. 3 years before the Kennedy assassination. Seems a little suspicious somehow. So all this stuff that's kind of contained in this universe of mind control, there's all these connections with all these major life events, including all the major assassinations, etc., etc., etc. And some of them are documented and some are just kind of query that. An example of another interesting coincidence is I know a guy named Hank Albarelli. Do you guys have his book here? A Terrible Mistake? It's about the death of Frank Olson.
Yes.
Okay, so he's a he's a very thorough researcher and scholar with lots of contacts inside the intelligence community that he speaks to. And so this book is, Frank Olson was working at Fort Detrick, which is the basically chemical warfare center of the Army, where Amadeo Marazzi worked, who was the Ames Leaf Room guy. And he was directly involved in LSD and other experiments. And it's this thick a book to tell the story, so I'm giving you the one paragraph summary. It looks like he was just about on the edge of becoming a whistleblower. And so he went to a party attended by Sidney Gottlieb, who was the head of MK Ultra, who ran MK Ultra, at a retreat not far from Washington, where he was slipped a dose of LSD and some Cointreau liqueur, went on a bad trip, came home, was all bent out of shape, was taken to see this guy Lashbrook, who is, so if somebody's having mental health problems, you probably would want to take him to an allergist in Washington, right? So he's taken to Lashbrook, who's an allergist in Washington, who just happens to be CIA contractor and LSD expert on the side. And they try and kind of help him out, and then he jumps out the window of the Statler Hotel from the 10th to 12th floor, dies. But actually, it's entirely a cover story. It's almost virtually for certain he was pushed. And this is a way to discredit the whistleblower because he suddenly developed this mental illness for no reason. And then he committed suicide. What a tragedy and loss. It was until the Carter administration that the 1975, there's a Rockefeller Commission report that I have. So it's a very small book. And in there's a description of a guy who was an Army chemist who committed suicide by jumping out of a window. And this is somehow tied into LSD research. Frank Olson's family read this, said, wait a minute, that's our dad. We didn't know this is tied into LSD experimentation. They got on the government, and Carter personally met with them, gave them like $750,000 settlement. But the guy who probably ran the operation for organizing, besides Lashbrook and Sidney Gottlieb, head of MK Ultra, another guy who was involved in the New York Operation Midnight Climax safe house was George White, who himself is involved in this whole story of the Frank Olson death. And it looks like the guy who pushed him out the window, there's two guys, but the main guy was Pierre Lafitte, who was sort of a undercover intelligence asset, thug, drug guy, maybe French Connection style guy. Pierre Lafitte previously worked at the Riley Coffee Company in New Orleans. One of his aliases was the last name of Hidell. He had a whole list of aliases, but in the book, Hank Albarelli lists a bunch of these aliases, one of which was, I forget the first name, but the last name was Hidell. And he worked at the Riley Coffee Company in New Orleans. The death of Frank Olson was in the 50s. The death of Lee Harvey Oswald was in the 60s. Lee Harvey Oswald worked at the Riley Coffee Company in New Orleans, and his identification, which you can see online, includes the identification for Alec Hidell. So the guy who supposedly, the patsy basically, who supposedly shot Kennedy, had an alias of Hedel, worked at the same coffee company as Pierre Lafitte, who killed Frank Olson, who also had an alias with the last name Hedel. It's funny all these coincidences that happen, huh? And there's just no possibility that this is coincidences. We're going to take a break here in a few minutes, sir. Okay, so these are some of the MK Ultra contractors. Martin Orne and Louis Jolyon West were directly connected with the Jekyll Hyde super spy manufacturer G.H. Estabrook. Published with them, went to his conferences, communicated with them. And their MK Ultra documents describe them doing work on hypnosis, dissociation, creating altered states of consciousness, and so on. George White, I've already talked about. He's the Operation Midnight Climax guy. I was a little surprised when I found out that Carl Rogers is on the list. Since I'm a psychiatrist, I've heard of Carl Rogers because he's a psychologist. He's one of the probably top 5 psychologists in the 20th century. And his therapy method that he developed is called client-centered psychotherapy. And he's a humanistic psychologist. So he's like the, I hear you saying that you're angry at your mother. How does it feel to be angry at your mother? I mean, he's like Mr. Touchy-feely, nice guy, therapist, humanitarian, etc., etc. Well, he was also cleared top secret under MK Ultra as a contractor on psychotherapy of schizophrenia, and he sat on the board of the Human Ecology Foundation, which was one of the front organizations through which the CIA funneled money to other investigators who often legitimately didn't know it was CIA money. So not only was he cleared at top secret as a mind control contractor himself personally, he was high up in the administrative hierarchy of overseeing the cutout organizations. The front organizations are called cutouts. And yet he's like Mr. Nice Guy Humanitarian. This is kind of knocks you back a little in your perception of your colleagues. One of the things I heard is these stories about kids being experimented on to be turned into Manchurian candidates. There's actually 4 MK Ultra sub-projects on children documented. None of them are particularly sinister, sort of, kind of. They're obviously not Manchurian candidate projects in and of themselves. But this is sub-project 103 in 1959, and there's still a website that's active for this, the Children's International Summer Village, and that's a photograph of a bunch of the kids. So what it is the investigator got money through Human Ecology or one of the other front organizations. I think it was Human Ecology, and apparently legitimately didn't know it was CIA money. And what he was doing at the summer camp was all these kids are brought there. Doesn't really exactly say how they're funded, but anyway, somehow they have enough money to bring all these kids from all these different countries to be at a summer camp. And the academic was studying how kids communicate when they don't share a common language. That was the project. So why would the CIA care about that? Well, they don't. The purpose of the project is described in the documents. The purpose of the project is to establish a relationship with young foreign nationals who may be of future interest to the agency. They're creating recruiting future double agents while they're children. And the academic exercise is just totally a cover story. It has nothing to do with anything. So the experiments, in fact, did include experiments on children. So project 103, it is felt that this project will serve to support the whiteout need for cover. In addition, will assist in the identification of promising young foreign nationals and U.S. nationals. I mean, that's directly a quote from the documents. So project 84, it's contemplated that Dr. Orne will be made witting of sponsorship on or about 1st September 1960. And for some reason, they never go September 1st, 1960. They're always going 1 September 1960. That's the way they write it, all the way through all these documents. And his subject is basic research on the nature of special states of consciousness, which today is focused on particular aspects of the trance state. Now, I actually met this guy. Time's ticking here. We'll stop in a slide or two for a break. Because he was on the DSM, is the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is the official diagnostic manual of the American Psychiatric Association, and it goes through different editions. So DSM-4, the 4th edition, came out in 1994. DSM-5 is coming out next May. And in the manual, there's all these sections. So there's a section for depression, schizophrenia, drug abuse, eating disorders. And I was on the committee for the dissociative disorders section, which includes multiple personality disorder. And so was Martin Orrin. So I actually sat on a committee with him, and he is the editor of, or was the editor, he died in the late 90s, of the International Journal of Clinical and Experimental Hypnosis, which is one of the 2 leading hypnosis journals. And in 1979, in Edmonton in medical school, I diagnosed a case of multiple personality myself, and which was a very interesting experience. And then I wrote it up, and it was actually published in 1984 in a special issue of the International Journal of Clinical and Experimental Hypnosis, edited by Martin Orrin. So it was just my good fortune to have this case history I'd written up, and he was just looking for one more paper to fill this special issue on hypnosis. I thought, oh, good. So it wasn't until a decade later that I found out that he was actually MK Ultra contractor. So these guys are directly involved in the day-to-day operations of civilian psychiatry. And some psychiatrists have no idea what the backstory is, and some are totally filled in. Another sort of twist in the story is in Toronto in the 80s, I was at a conference and met Chris Sizemore, who is the real Eve of the Three Faces of Eve, which was a book and a movie in the mid to late 50s. The book sold 2 million copies, and Joanne Woodward won an Oscar for portraying Chris Sizemore, Eve, in the movie The Three Faces of Eve. And it's still referred to in all standard psychology texts, and you can still get it on Netflix or one of those old-fashioned things like where they actually had these physical tapes you had to put in a machine. So it's really the most famous case history and the most financially successful case history by psychiatrists ever in the history of the human race. And one of the books I have here is called The Rape of Eve, which is me and Chris Sizemore and another guy who's collaborating on the project, again all based on documents, are telling the backstory, The Rape of Eve, subtitled The True Story Behind the Three Faces of Eve. So the authors of the book, Thigpen and Cleckley, psychiatrists, in 1953, it was really Thigpen doing it, Cleckley was kind of in the background, had Chris Sizemore in his office without any involvement, so he's her psychiatrist treating her for multiple personality, has her sign a contract without outside counsel, without family involvement, with no lawyer present, signing over all of her lifetime story rights to him and his partner, for which he paid her $3, $1 for each of her 3 alter personalities, all of whom signed the contract, a copy of which is in the appendix to the book. So the patient made $3 off a book that sold 2 million copies. It's the greatest story of financial exploitation by psychiatrists on the history of the planet. 1956, again, no outside counsel, no family involvement. She signs another contract where she signs over the movie rights to 20th Century Fox, for which this time she got $5,000 of a movie that's still in print, still being watched. And there's many ways in which he abused, controlled, and exploited her, all documented. And in the book, The Three Faces of Eve, they talk about getting her handwriting analyzed by a military psychologist at Camp Gordon. Thigpen himself was formerly a military psychologist at Fort Bragg. They took her to a meeting on a military base and displayed her to the audience of military psychiatrists as an interesting case of multiple personality. And in the book they have a kind of a psychological analysis procedure done to look at whether her alter personalities are distinctly different or not. And the guy who is the consultant on that, Charles Osgood, is himself a top secret cleared MK Ultra contractor. And they published a paper in the journal edited by Martin Orn, who is a top secret MK Ultra contractor. So it looks to me like not only is this the worst case of medical malpractice in terms of financial exploitation ever, but these guys are also plugged into this network of mind control doctors. Why don't we take just kind of a short break? I'll carry on, then we'll be able to get into some questions, discussion too.
Find your seats.
So Louis Jolyon West is known as Jolly West because he's a very jolly guy, I assume. Top secret cleared MK Ultra contractor, the psychobiology of dissociated states, and tied into the whole network of people. So including Martin Orn, including G.H. Estabrook, who was the Manchurian candidate guy in the Second World War. And he's famous for several different things. One of his greatest accomplishments was killing an elephant at Oklahoma City Zoo with a dose of LSD. So that's one of his claims to fame. When he was head of the Department of Psychiatry at the University of Oklahoma, he then moved to UCLA, where he was for a number of years. While he was the chairman, one of the professors, Thelma Moss, was a CIA contractor on paranormal type research. He was involved in the UCLA Violence Project, which was actually approved by Ronald Reagan when he was the governor of California, but shut down by public protest before it actually became operational. It was to be based at a used Nike missile site. They were going to take sex offenders, put electrodes in their brain, and there would be both a tracking electrode and an immobilization electrode, basically. So they would track these guys when they were released from prison. If they went outside a restricted area, a signal would be sent to their brain, immobilizing them, and the police would come pick them up. And the head of NIMH, National Institute of Mental Health, later on from this, stated that the riots in Watts were caused by a genetic defect in the male Negro. And one of the ways to control these kind of people would be to implant electrodes in the general population. So Jolly West was sitting there in Los Angeles, and there was a murder in Dallas. So they called him in to examine the murderer, whose name was Jack Ruby. So, okay, here we are, the police department in Dallas. We've got Jack Ruby in custody. We want a psych evaluation. Who are you gonna call? Like, there's no psychiatrist in Dallas? Why do we call a top secret cleared MK Ultra mind control contractor who's an expert in dissociative states, hypnosis? Can't be random coincidence. Now flash forward to the 1995s. Timothy McVeigh is arrested for the Oklahoma City bombing, taken to Tinker Air Force Base, where he alleges that a computer chip was removed from his buttocks, and a psychiatrist has brought in Louis Jolyon West. So Louis Jolyon West, Martin Orn, Margaret Singer, and Robert Lifton were expert witnesses at the Patty Hearst trial. Patty Hearst was who's William Randolph Hearst, Citizen Kane family, mega bazillionaire newspaper family. She's not hurting for money. She's an undergraduate at University of Berkeley. She's in her apartment with her boyfriend Stephen Weed when the Symbionese Liberation Army storms in, guns literally blazing, there's gunfire. Her boyfriend Stephen Weed's knocked out with a rifle butt. She's put in the trunk of the car, taken away to the Symbionese Liberation Army safe house, where she's kept in a closet for 45 days. There's mock FBI raids during which she thinks she'll be killed at any time. She's raped in the closet, extreme sensory deprivation, sensory isolation. I'm running through the list of mind control techniques now. She then subsequently participates in a bank robbery under the name of Tanya and is photographed during the bank robbery. She's put in jail, tried, convicted, At her trial, her expert witnesses are Martin Orne, Jolly West, Margaret Singer, and Robert Lifton. Margaret Singer was one of the group of psychiatrists and psychologists who interviewed the Korean War pilots after they came back having made false confessions of German warfare, along with Jolly West. Robert Lifton wrote a book about the Nazi doctors and also was part of the team that interviewed these downed Korean War pilots. So these guys were all experts in mind control as performed on American pilots by the Communist Chinese in the first part of the 50s. They then became Orne and West became contractors on the CIA's mind control programs. Then after the CIA's mind control programs were finished, they became experts in destructive cults and said the destructive cults use the same techniques. And Jolly West was on the board of the Cult Awareness Foundation, which is basically trying to help people, you know, been captured by cults and disconnected from their families and brainwashed and so on, get out of the cult and get back to their family, and trying to educate and support the family members and so on. So I did a talk at their conference in the early 90s in Minneapolis. And it's kind of one of those big ballrooms where then they have all these dividers that divide it into smaller rooms. And I give my talk, which was explaining what dissociative disorders are and how these cults probably create a type of dissociative disorder where you've got the cult personality and the old person is suppressed. And I've already checked out of my room and I've got my suitcase down at the Bell Captain. And okay, finished, and have a few questions, and then it's time to go, and I'm kind of about to walk out. The organizers come up, it's okay, where's your luggage? So, well, it's down the Bell Captain, I'll get it. No, give me the tag. They escort me out the back, through the kitchen, down the stairs, out the door. I'm escorted to the car that's waiting behind the hotel. I get in the car, there's the driver and another guy gets in the car with me. They take me to the airport and they walk me, this is before you had to go through security like you do now, up until I'm checked in and I'm walking to the gate. The reason they did that was because the previous year, the registration booth had been stormed by the Children of God cult and Scientology. Scientology was started by L. Ron Hubbard, who worked for naval intelligence, and the big conflict between sociology and psychiatry was primarily between L. Ron Hubbard and Louis Jolyon West. And so the Scientology got upset because the Cult Awareness Network that Louis Jolyon West was on was saying that Scientology was a cult. So after they stormed the booth the prior year, subsequently they sued the Cult Awareness Network, and of course they won the case because they had gigantic legal capabilities and cult awareness was just this little thing. And now the Church of Scientology owns the Cult Awareness Network and operates it. Even stranger than that, about 5 years ago, I was at the Scientology owns CCHR, Citizens Committee on Human Rights, which attacks psychiatry. And I've actually, 5 years or so ago, at the big Beverly Hilton Hotel in LA, I was at a 1,500 person black tie dinner where I walked on the stage and everybody's applauding and cheering when I was getting an award from CCHR for my CIA doctor's book. So, and the trip to LA was half funded by the hospital I consult to in LA and half funded by Scientology. So this is just more examples of how the tentacles of these mind control people are involved in all these big public events, bombings, disasters. Okay, so we got a frozen computer here. So you could just kind of it's such a huge web. You can kind of wander around this web, giving more examples, more examples, more examples. So in the UCLA Violence Project, Jolly West, thanks, is connected to Robert Heath at Tulane University, who's going to come up in a minute. Carl Rogers, I already told you about, so we can jump over that. This is George White, that's the safe house. Now we're at brain electrode experiments at Tulane. Robert Heath. So this is the Journal of Nervous and Mental Disease, and I've published in that journal myself. So the titles of the papers are Pleasure and Brain Activity in Man, Deep and Surface Electroencephalograms During Orgasm. Septal stimulation of the initiation of heterosexual activity in a homosexual male. So there's still a Robert Heath Society at Tulane, even though he's dead. So he's like a famous, revered guy. And he's connected to the brain electrode implant guys at UCLA, Jolly West. He's also part of a network of other brain electrode implant doctors at Yale and Harvard. They're all part of this small universe. So in this article here, which is 1972, he's treating a serious mental disorder known as being gay. So back then, it was officially a mentally disorder. Being gay just by itself was a mental disorder. So these guys got beaten down politically and had to pull it out of the manual in 1980. But back then, they were treating a mental disorder. So the way they treated this guy, and this is all described in this paper, and Heath was funded by all the different branches of the military and the CIA. And he was actually funded under another program because when you look at the documents, if he's funded under MK Ultra, it'll say MK something or other. It'll describe what the project number is. And he had CIA funding through a set of other projects which were XG hyphen and then the numbers. So there's a whole nother project under the designation XG that's totally classified that nobody knows anything about. So again, we're just talking the tip of the iceberg. But what he did is he put electrodes in this gay guy's brain, who was 19 years old, and he studied his brain electrical activity, and then he hooked him up to a little belt. So I've got a little belt here. On his belt, he had a button in a box, and he could push the button because the wire went from the box to the electrode into his brain, and bring himself to kind of a pre-orgasmic state. So they had to take the box away from him because he pushed the button 1,500 times in 3 hours. So then they were in control of the box, and they stimulated him. This is just all professional work, just like the guys watching through the one-way mirror in San Francisco. They had him watch heterosexual pornography over and over and over and over while in a pre-orgasmic state to try and condition him to become straight. And then they, funded by the taxpayer, hired a prostitute to come into Tulane to have sex with him while they were reading his EEG printout from the electrodes. And then afterwards they debriefed him and the prostitute as to how the sex went. They both said, great. And then he was basically cured of homosexuality and only had one relapse and 9 months follow-up. This is the stuff these guys were doing. So it's kind of comical, and it gets uncomical. So there's this Heath Society. I mean, he's still a big, revered guy. Now we're getting to the less comical part. So this is the brain electrode team at Harvard. And not only is this all overlap with mind control, it also interconnects with biological weapons and radiation weapons experiments. So the neurosurgeon, these guys are psychiatrists, psychologists. The neurosurgeon on the Harvard brain electrode implant team, William Sweet, his testimony is in the Clinton administration report on radiation experiments, which was commissioned by Clinton, and it came out like 98 or something like that. And in there, it describes the subject of the experiment was HP7, HP-7, HP standing for human product. So he's designated human product 7. This guy came into the ER at one of the Harvard hospitals unconscious, was injected with plutonium, and died before ever regaining consciousness. From which I infer that he did not give informed consent. So he was a John Doe. I mean, he wasn't even, they didn't talk to his relatives, they didn't talk to anybody. They injected him with plutonium. And that's part of a set of plutonium experiments where people were injected with plutonium without being told what it was so that they could scan them later and see how the body metabolizes plutonium. And William Sweet was part of that, and he was part of the brain electrode implant team that brings us back into MK Ultra Bluebird Artichoke. And so they're putting electrodes in these people to cure them of epilepsy. Teresa, and these are case examples, Teresa L. was a 38-year-old woman who masturbated compulsively 18 to 20 times per day, had sex with female prostitutes, had sex with more than one man at a time, and had attempted to castrate her husband with a broken bottle. You think maybe she was sexually abused as a child? You think maybe she was angry at men? So their approach to this problem was put electrodes in her brain and try and control her behavior by stimulating electrodes from a remote transmitter box. Jenny, a 14-year-old girl, a baby cry was able to provoke an extreme behavioral change in Jenny. An extreme behavioral change would include she previously murdered her 2 young stepsisters. So what happened in this girl's life that a baby crying triggered her so extremely, and why had she murdered her stepsisters? This doesn't happen just because you have some odd form of epilepsy that causes you to murder your stepsisters. But again, they're treating this completely out of the social context as if it's just a brain disease. Jose Delgado, you can actually find him on YouTube. You can see the video where he's in the bull ring with the bull that comes charging at him. The bull's got electrodes in his brain. He pushes the box and the bull just goes over there. It's easily just search Jose Delgado bull experiment on YouTube. So his book is called Physical Control of the Mind, published by a mainstream New York-based academic publisher. And one of his papers is intracerebral radio stimulation and recording in completely free patients. So he, on contract to the Office of Naval Research, made the technical advance of you don't have to have a wire going from the box to the port to the electrode in your brain. You can stitch up the person's skin, it's all healed over, and you can stimulate the electrode remotely using a radio signal. And he has papers where he puts an electrode in there's the alpha monkey in the troop, and before the experiment, you see all the other males are like all over in this corner of the cage, and the alpha monkey's like the big man ruling the cage. Then they put an electrode in the alpha monkey's brain, and when you stimulate his brain, he just sits there passively. And then they put a lever inside the cage so the other monkeys can make the guy passive. And then you see the next photo is the alpha monkey's like in the corner and all the other guys are ruling the whole cage. He does this with cats, dogs, and when he's writing about cats and dogs, he calls them mechanical toys. And there's pictures in the book of a 16-year-old girl. She's got this totally vacant, stupid grin on her face. She's pounding on the wall furiously, or she's looking normal, depending on which button he's pushing on the transmitter box to simulate which of the electrodes implanted in her brain. 16-year-old girl. An 11-year-old boy put electrodes in that kid, and when he stimulated a certain electrode, the boy started to say that he thought he was a girl and he wanted to marry Dr. Delgado. Here's these crazy monkeys. This is some of the stuff going on in the monkey cage. You can't really see that very well. That's just a picture of somebody who's got a bandage on their head, but they can be stimulated remotely. So this is where we really get to it. This is his book, Physical Control of the Mind. We need a program of psychosurgery and political control of our society. The purpose is physical control of the mind. Everyone who deviates from the given norm can be surgically mutilated. Man does not have the right to develop his own mind. This kind of liberal orientation has great appeal. We must electrically control the brain. Someday, armies and generals will be controlled by electrical stimulation of the brain. He literally, this is a Yale professor of neurosurgery. He literally wanted electrodes in every brain in the population, not counting himself, of course. But even, I mean, the controlling elite would be so small, even the generals would have electrodes in their brains. This is what he wanted. If he was in charge and could carry it out, we all would have electrodes in our brains. And these guys are not fooling around. And this is not some paranoid interpretation. No, this is what they're actually saying. And this is back in the 70s. So imagine how miniaturized, even down to the nanotechnology level, how computerized and how satellite driven all of this must be now. This is just, I already talked about this. So this is Jones A, Jones B. He's describing in great detail the Manchurian candidate creation. And this is how this network is constructed. So DID is dissociative identity disorder equals multiple personality disorder, and the Manchurian candidate is an artificially created multiple personality disorder. Why is the Manchurian candidate called the Manchurian candidate? Well, that's because that's the name of the book and the movie, but why is that the name of the book? So several years before the book came out, in the Bluebird Artichoke documents, there's a memo from one CIA guy to another CIA guy saying, we need to look into these allegations that a group of American GIs has been captured while passing through a zone in Manchuria, has been subjected to hypnosis and other brainwashing techniques, and has amnesia for that period of time. This is the plot of the Manchurian Candidate book and movie. It's in the CIA documents years before the book was published. Again, how likely is that to be a coincidence? Not very likely. So, DID is the artificial multiple personality disorder. Now, I and others in the field who work with civilian multiple personality patients who are starting to tell us these kind of mind control stories, and we're like, don't know if it's real, don't know if it's not real, but we're hearing the stories. In April 1992, the False Memory Syndrome Foundation was created, and on the board of the False Memory Syndrome Foundation is Martin Orne, Jolly West, a number of other people, and they systematically attack the dissociative disorders field, saying that all these cases, maybe literally one or two exceptions, some people say 100%, others are like 99%, all of these civilian cases are based on false memory, implanted unwittingly by the therapist, and it's iatrogenic multiple personality. It's created by the doctor. It's kind of a fantasy created in therapy. It didn't exist before the therapy. And all the memories are false. The guys who ran the Manchurian Candidate programs are saying this in public in the same time period as patients coming into civilian therapy are starting to talk about being victims of mind control and being used as Manchurian candidates. So, False Memory Syndrome Foundation includes Martin Orne. John Gittiger was the lead psychologist. He said in testimony to the U.S. Senate in the 70s that the Manchurian Candidate is fiction, but he was himself directly involved in psychological testing. He himself took LSD back, according to himself, back in the day. This was directly involved with the CIA, directly involved with MKUltra. The False Memory Syndrome Foundation, Martin Orne was on the head of it, on the board. So was Paul McHugh. Paul McHugh was chairman of Department of Psychiatry at Johns Hopkins. Johns Hopkins was an MKUltra site. He said 100% of these cases are illusory. They're all based on false memories. When the Catholic Church was being hit with all these lawsuits for sexual misconduct by priests, they formed a board to advise them what to do and how to handle this. On that board, they had one psychiatrist, Paul McHugh, who says it's all false memories. Priests never did anything wrong. Martin Orne is directly connected to G.H. Estabrooks. Martin Orne is directly connected to the CIA. The CIA is directly connected to military intelligence, which is MKUltra, Bluebird Artichoke. Johns Hopkins is an MKUltra site. Walter Reed Army Hospital, Paul McHugh worked there. Military intelligence people work at Walter Reed. Brain electrode implant experiments were done at Walter Reed. Manchurian candidate creation was done by Estabrooks, was done in Bluebird and Artichoke, was done by military intelligence. So it's just this huge network. And these guys are all in the False Memory Syndrome Foundation. They publish with each other, and they testified in hundreds of lawsuits against therapists in the early 90s saying it was all malpractice, it was all false memories, it was all multiple personality created out of nowhere. And that's the way the whole thing is organized. It's this huge distributed network of relationships and connections at numerous different levels for numerous different purposes. So that's kind of the end of the slides. Just going into the techniques, somebody was asking me to talk about the techniques a little more. So if you look at the photographs that came out of Abu Ghraib, so first of all you have to say to yourself, hold on, okay, Abu Ghraib prison, there's not, when you go through security at the airport, you're in secure space. Okay, well that's kind of secure. When you go into Abu Ghraib prison, that's about as secure as space gets. I mean, this is military, a US military prison with CIA actively on site. You can't just kind of walk in there and say, hey, would you like to buy some books or magazines, or here's a hamburger or something. I mean, you've got to get through a whole security thing just to get in the building. And you can't just kind of walk in there with a camera and take a bunch of pictures and send them off to a newspaper. It can't happen. But the story that we hear in public is there's some rogue, low-level US military guys who took some pictures for fun and then leaked it out, and they take the fall for this. But Seymour Hersh, who's been writing, he's a journalist who's been writing about military intelligence stuff for decades, actually wrote an article saying the code names of the mind control operations that were on site at Abu Ghraib at that time. These are organized programmatic mind control programs. And when you look at the photographs, what are the techniques? Which is the same as we know is going on at Guantanamo Bay. There's behavioral science consultation teams at Guantanamo Bay that are psychologists who go in there and run the interrogation programs, run the psychological part of it. And there's physicians consulting to this because you don't want to push the guy, unless you do want him to die, you don't want to push him too far because he might die. All completely violates all medical ethics. And the techniques that we know are used are hooding, sitting in very stressful positions like crouched down against the wall for prolonged periods, sensory deprivation, sensory isolation, some degree of beatings, waterboarding, which we know is not torture, it's just talking to somebody. We know that there's, unless this is just random, out of control, low-level people in the Abu Ghraib photos, we know that there's sexual humiliation, there's humiliating their culture, the Quran and their religious beliefs, there's forcing them to do sexual acts with each other. Female military officers come in and come on to them sexually, aggravate them sexually. I'm sure hallucinogens are used. These are the techniques of mind control. There's not just one thing that you do. And I say that mind control is kind of at two levels. There's general mind control, which would include propaganda, disinformation, spinning things in the media and so on. Oh, isn't it funny that those two guys were named Raymond Lee Harvey and Oswaldo Ortiz? That's a mind control program of disinformation. But there's not a doctor working directly on you. The level of mind control I'm interested in I call psychiatric mind control, where there's an actual doctor in a one-to-one relationship with the person. And I'm interested in that because it's a gigantic violation of professional ethics. So at Abu Ghraib and at Guantanamo Bay, we've got psychiatric level mind control going on. And in the G.H. Estabrooks documents, he doesn't describe it in great detail. But what you find is you look around in all the Bluebird Artichoke documents, all the bits and pieces are kind of spread around in the documents. And they're exactly these things: sensory deprivation, sensory isolation, food deprivation, sleep deprivation, mock killings, hoodings, scaring the person to death, good cop, bad cop interrogations, softening them up with drugs and hallucinogens, hypnosis, and then brain electrode implants. In the second version of the Manchurian Candidate movie by Denzel Washington, there's brain electrode scenes in there. And so you think, oh, that's just Hollywood. It's all these things like in The Bourne Identity, Manchurian Candidate. Of course, it's Hollywood movies and they're fictionalized and the actual mind control doctors aren't actually that good looking, for one thing. But the elements are all actual reality in these different movies. There's nothing in the Bourne movies that isn't in the Bluebird, Artichoke, etc. documents. All the bits and pieces are there. What are the odds that this isn't going on today? 0.0. We know it's going on at Guantanamo Bay and Abu Ghraib. We know that renditions are being done currently. So it's not a conspiracy theory. It's a known public fact. The debates are not, is this stuff going on? The debates are, is waterboarding torture or not? But nobody says waterboarding is not going on. And you can see photographs on the internet. It's just like these non-lethal weapons, which are the beaming energy out of a person's brain. Not necessarily with an implanted electrode. You can just go online and search for these weapons. There's articles in US News and World Report talking about Sandia Labs, which is in New Mexico, which is a big military contractor. It describes the type of, it's a US Air Force aircraft, the type of aircraft, the altitude it's flying at, the detailed specs of the electromagnetic energy that's beamed at the subject, how far it penetrates the person's skin, what the effects are. And you can see photographs online that are easily searchable in Wikipedia of sort of Humvee type vehicles with these weapons mounted on them. I mean, these things exist. So we know for a fact that Operation Midnight Climax, unwitting civilians were given LSD without knowing it. We know that people were injected with plutonium without knowing what was going on. We know that at the Fernald School in the US Northeast, mentally retarded children were part of an experimental program studying nutrition. The parents were told that they were studying nutrition, and the parents said, okay. The nutritional substance that was put in their cereal was plutonium. Mentally retarded kids. They directly lied to their parents about it. I have papers that are referenced in the book where doctors on contract to the Army are giving bacteria to children on purpose. And then there's articles in the medical journal, back and forth, correspondence, debating whether this is ethical or not. So I've got documentation that sort of odd Serratia marisons bacteria, which is, you never see it in clinical practice, was released in the San Francisco Bay Area. And I've got a paper from a medical journal documenting like 35 cases of infection by this strange rare bacteria in the months following that public exposure, which never has happened in the history of the world elsewhere. You never find that many cases clustered in one time period like that. So we also know that in experiments done in the 70s, I think, it's in the book, I think it's the 70s, but anyway, radiation was released over Spokane, Washington, and tracked to see its wind dispersal patterns. We already know that there's all those US soldiers exposed to atomic bombs and got tons of radiation. So all these things have happened for sure. Unwitting civilians have been exposed to hypnosis, LSD, chemical, biological, and radiological weapons. We know that these non-lethal weapons exist, that they can affect your mental state, your behavior, they can cause pain, they can cause confusion, they can knock you out. What are the odds that those weapons have never been tested on unwitting civilians? I say 0. So therefore, all these crazy people with the tinfoil helmets who say that the CIA is beaming energy at them, I'm sure some are mentally ill and it's not happening. I doubt all of them. So my message to my colleagues is, instead of knowing for a fact that everybody who makes these kind of allegations is obviously delusional and needs medication, you should take a step back and say to yourself, this is perfectly plausible and possible. Things like this have been done in my lifetime in this country. It's not impossible. It's perfectly possible that some people are having these kind of weapons beamed at them and it's affecting their mental state. And I'd say the odds that that's not going on are basically just about zero. So, everybody's been very quiet in terms of questions. We do have some time for questions. Go ahead.
How many of those people that you're talking about that are basically denying the fact that these people are out there with dissociative state, or that are claiming that these weapons are being used to some degree, how many of those people would you say are disinformation agents? Like as a percentage?
I really can't give a for real estimate on that. I know it's not 100%, it's not 0%, for sure. And it's like I was explaining before, there's some people like generally are in the field of psychiatry who just kind of like don't know about this. They're not implicated at all. They're guilty of being the good Germans who look the other way because it's out there in the public.
Being influenced by those.
And they're being influenced, yeah, and they're all a bunch of sheep who follow the leaders and everything.
Right.
So they're not exactly off the hook, but they're not directly actively involved. Then I think there's a group of people who kind of are somewhat involved and kind of somewhat know something about it, but they think they're being patriotic and it's all for some kind of greater good. And then there's a bunch of people who are just like Nazi doctors, basically, who are basically running the show.
So it's just a layered thing in your eyes, and
Yeah.
of course that's the only way it really can be.
Right.
How far along the road are we, do you think? Because I think that they probably have made a lot more advances. Usually the things that we know about are, 30 years behind what they really know, what they're really doing. And as you say, because of the declassified stuff.
One of my sons who was kind of about this tall, this hockey coach, worked for one of the major defense contractors. And of course they can't talk about what they're working on. But he said, we work on stuff that won't come into the field for 25 years. And so, I mean, we know that. We know that, like, the stealth fighter jet was completely classified. Nobody in the public knew about it. Not even the president knew about it and it was in the air flying around. So, basically, I'm just going to repeat what you said. My answer is going to be the same as your question. This stuff has got to be way more high-tech than we imagine. So one of the things, I get people writing to me, emailing and so on, who are victims of non-lethal weapons experimentation, and then they want me to somehow do something about it. Like I'm supposed to tell them to cut it out or something. And some people their thought processes are just all jumbled up and completely chaotic. So whether it's real or not, they're obviously severely mentally disturbed. But many other people who contact me are perfectly lucid, perfectly rational. Their story is completely plausible. It all follows. They knew this person in the military, or their dad was in something or other, how they got into it. Or sometimes it's like they were going to be a whistleblower in some private company and then it started, or there's some political dispute and then it started. It's completely plausible. But it's a beautiful method of mind control because it's so deniable and you sound so crazy when you assert it. But one of the issues is, so when you go back to the 50s, they were like knocking monkeys out. Now people are saying, we know for sure you can knock somebody out, you can disable them, you can disorient them, you can make them have horrible diarrhea, you can cause pain in their skin, and you can actually, if you just crank it up, you can kill them. But people are claiming that this technology can actually make you hear sentences and paragraphs. That they can actually directly implant sentences and paragraphs and words in your mind that you hear out loud inside your head. It sounds a little fantastic technically speaking because the brain is so flippin' complicated. But on the other hand, I'm sure the technology's like way out there in the science fiction level. So that's, but I can't show you a document where it's published in a mainstream journal where they're showing experimentally that they're putting sentences in somebody's head. So that's just an example of, you kind of get to the edge of the documentation, then you hear the allegations, you go, you can't prove it, but on the other hand, I wonder where we are at. And then you can either like believe it or not believe it, have your personal opinion. That's kind of the way the whole thing's set up.
Now I've heard before of, I don't have the paperwork, it's a new type of speaker where you put your voice over high frequency sound, beam it at someone's head 50, 100 feet away, and you will hear in your head music, your voice.
Right.
You put sound in it to hurt your brain, you'll hurt it.
Right.
If somebody is a bit off already, you put that into their brain to drive them even more nuts.
Right, right.
Hear the dead husband, whatever, you can drive them over the edge.
There is public domain information. There's some technology in Japan which has got to do with, if I'm speaking, I can't remember the exact details of it, but the basic idea is if I'm speaking, you can sort of beam back what I say to me just with a tiny little time lag, and my brain will get so confused I'll just start stuttering and I won't be able to talk.
Well, there's supposedly you
So-
can buy a truck with the speakers above them in your head,
Right.
so each person gets their own
I'm
sound.
just saying technology that's out in that direction exists for sure. Documented, no
Yeah.
question. Oh, some people at the back have their hands up first there, I think. Go ahead.
Today, we're waking up as a society, and there's more awareness of this type of stuff going on.
Right.
Do you think that they're doing some mass mind control right now in water or in contrails or whatever it may be, or television programming?
So whatever, for those who don't know,
And secondly, are you in danger yourself because you're, right
well,
now?
I published this book under, the first I published it under the title Bluebird in 2000, but then I thought, nobody's going to know what the heck Bluebird is, so I changed the title of the CIA Doctors, it's the same book. So I've been talking in public about this since the 90s, I had a book out there, and before the book came out, it's a roundabout answer here, so I had an agent who's in Edmonton who's died since, but she was representing me on a book proposal on this stuff in the 90s, under the title The CIA Doctors. So then I changed it to Bluebird, then I changed it back to CIA Doctors. So she sent this 1.5-page proposal out to 10 different publishers. One rejected it, and this is the almost exact quote. Nobody would want to read this book except the 10 million people who watch the X-Files every week. That was his reason for rejecting it. I'm not sure if the stockholders in the company thought that was a good decision. But a woman came into my office with, who was consulting me on unrelated clinical stuff, with a copy of a fax that had the fax number at the top that had been sent to a little bit of a rag magazine in Dallas. And so I found out who the fax number was, and I found out that because it was my book proposal, it was a page and a half long, it had been leaked by one of these editors to Lawrence Wright, who is kind of a debunking conspiracy theories kind of writer, who also wrote a book attacking the therapists like me for implanting false memories. So why did that go to Lawrence Wright, who has already written a book debunking, he debunks any kind of conspiracy stuff in general, and attacking the dissociative disorders field. And then that was sort of passed around the false memory syndrome field, so to speak. And I was attacked in several different medical journals, Esquire magazine, newspapers, a bunch of cable documentaries and so on, as a nut who believes all this kind of stuff. In the years up to 2000 when the book came out, total silence since. Because it's totally based on documents. All the conspiracy stuff that interests me, I just left out on purpose, so nobody could attack anything because everything was documented. And so it just all went silent. And my car's never blown up, and nobody's ever threatened me, and I've never had white powder in an envelope arrive at my door. So for some reason, somebody thinks that I'm not a threat. And I think the main reason is I'm not talking about currently operational stuff and identifying current people. That's the only reason I can.
I know of a guy I've exposed him in the paper before, but James Randi, the Amazing Randy, well, less than Amazing Randy.
I know James Brady. I've actually got a challenge in him.
Yeah, well, you know his character. You know, he offers $1 million if any psychic can figure out what number he has in his safe. Well, you know, he can
I have
he can
a
change
challenge.
the number anytime he wants. The point is, he started his career by stealing the number out of safe.
Right.
To win a prize at a radio program one time.
One of the MK Ultra top secret contractors was John Mulholland, who was a magician, who was teaching the CIA sleight of hand techniques and trickery techniques. Yeah, I wouldn't be the least surprised if he was a CIA asset.
So then he's gone into maybe the CIA is involved. It looks like they're paying him to do this too. So he also tries to debunk the false memories.
Yeah, he's tied into false memory people totally.
Said to you guys to put these in his mind.
Yeah.
In the meantime, on his website, I found a secret page on there where his gang advises, there's a gang advice to try and debunk people who tell the truth about the 9/11.
Oh yeah, yeah.
They share notes about how to say, you know, all the pictures.
There's cross membership between the False Memory Syndrome Foundation and the Scientific Committee for Investigation of Claims of the Paranormal.
That's great, yeah.
Which, yeah. So those guys are all the same gang.
Yeah, they are. The Skeptic, all the Skeptic.
Skeptic magazine, yeah, they talk
All the
9/11.
same outfit.
Same outfit. I agree totally.
Okay, I would like to hear a little bit more about that it was, or what you talk about it was. I know the whole program is expansive, but I'd like to know how far they went with that. I'd like to know if you know of other experiments like this using black people. And also Margaret Singer, is she the one who's working with eugenics?
I don't think she's tied into eugenics. The eugenics story is a tied-in backstory there, but actually, the Nazi eugenicists learned most of their thinking from American eugenicists. And Oliver Wendell Holmes was the Chief Justice, one of the Chief Justices. One of his quotes is, 3 generations of imbeciles are enough. It so happens it was a white woman. So it was a mandatory sterilization case where the mother was a prostitute, the woman was an imbecile who got pregnant, and she had a daughter who was also mentally retarded. The daughter died around age 12 or so of a disease and was doing very well at normal school. She was a high-performing student at normal school. The mother was institutionalized for the rest of her life after she was sterilized and was a voracious reader of all kinds of adult intellectual kind of books. So the whole sterilization movement, I mean, it was targeted at black people some, but not exclusively. Do you know about the Tuskegee syphilis study?
I do know. I look at this.
I have a chapter on that in my CIA doctor's book. So, ultra quick, 1932 to 1972, the Tuskegee syphilis study, and the purpose of this is to illustrate the massive, massive violations of human rights by doctors, published in mainstream medical journals, going on for decades with nobody saying boo. So the Tuskegee syphilis study, the head nurse, Eunice Rivers, received a lifetime commendation and award from the U.S. Public Health Service for running the study as the head nurse. It was at times funded by the U.S. Public Health Service, the Centers for Disease Control, the American Heart Fund was involved. And the study was basically 400 black, illiterate guys in rural Alabama with syphilis were actively denied treatment for 40 years of follow-up. At the 25-year point of the study, the Surgeon General of the United States signed a certificate. They all got a signed certificate and $25, 1 year for every year of participation in the study. And I have a paper published in around about 1965. I have a copy in a file. Untreated syphilis in the male Negro, a 25-year follow-up, something like that. So this is published in the mainstream literature, that we're denying treatment for active syphilis to 400 guys, and then we have 400 control guys. And this Eunice River went around, when everybody said, oh, I'm going to start treating this guy, she said, no, he's in study, he can't be treated. And the outcome of the study was that they discovered that if you have untreated syphilis, you have more health problems and you die earlier. Okay, so now that's totally insane. And it wasn't white senators' daughters who were in the study, it was rural black guys. So there's a whole racist element to it. But think of it for a second. 400 guys for 40 years engaged in how many acts of intercourse and fathered how many children with congenital syphilis? None of which could be identified or treated? I mean, it's literally Nazi death camp level ethical violations. So I'm not aware, all kinds of groups have been targeted who are politically easy to target and get away with. Black people are in there, but it hasn't been, as far as I can tell, not predominantly targeted at black people. And in terms of the Watts riots and all that, the UCLA Violence Project was shut down. And so they never did pop electrodes into all kinds of black people's heads.
Do you know if this type of mind control is being used in the highly developed countries like Russia, China, scientifically?
I don't know in terms of I have documents that prove it, but I would imagine that basically all organized countries with intelligence services are running these kind of programs offensively and defensively around the world. I would assume that. It's unbelievable to me that it's not true. But I can't actually prove it.
It seems to me that the programs and what you're outlining have a lot to do with population